الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد قائد الغر الميامين وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on the Mukhtasar of Sahih al-Bukhari, we have, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, reached lesson number 22, and this is on rights and good dealings. And this continues our look at mu'amalat, at financial dealings and financial responsibilities of the believer. This work that we're looking at, the Mukhtasar of Sahih al-Bukhari, is a beautiful abridgment, as we mentioned, by Imam Ibn Abi Jamra of Imam Bukhari's Sahih, with a focus on the aims, the values, and the key principles of guidance, of hidayah. And that's why he gave it the title that he gave it, even though it's famous as Mukhtasar Ibn Abi Jamra, right? It tends to be published just as Mukhtasar Ibn Abi Jamra, the abridgment of Ibn Abi Jamra, even though its formal title has to do with this notion of the beginning and end of guidance, the beginning and aims of guidance. So, we are looking today at hadiths related to husnul mu'amala, to good dealings and the fulfillment of rights. So the first of these hadiths is a hadith related by Sayyidah Aisha radiyallahu ta'ala anha,
عن عائشة رضي الله عنها قالت هند أم معاوية لرسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن أبا سفيان رجل شحيح فهل علي جناح أن آخذ من ماله سرا؟ قال خذي أنت وبنيك ما يكفيك بالمعروف.
So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so Sayyidah Aisha radiyallahu ta'ala anha relates that Hind, the mother of Muawiyah radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma, said to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, truly Abu Sufyan is stingy or has stinginess. So is there any harm if I take from his wealth secretly, right? If I take from his wealth secretly. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam responded that take you and your children what you need in a good way. What do you need, or what is sufficient? So this hadith contains multiple important lessons, right? It's also important to understand it in the context of the general principles, right? Firstly, an issue arises that is this hadith not an instance of backbiting? Because Jazakallah khair, Hind asked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam about taking wealth, but she mentioned a quality that is negative in the person, right? So the first question that arises from the hadith, that isn't Hind's mention here of the stinginess of her husband, a case of backbiting. Because what is backbiting? What is backbiting? What's the definition of backbiting?
ذكرك أخاك ما يكره.
Yeah. Is you're mentioning your brother with that which they would dislike. Right? So the answer would be that yes, this would be backbiting. But backbiting, its general ruling is impermissibility. But it is makhsus. It is specified by situations of actual need. Right? But this is exceptional. Right? So that which is considered at the level of necessity or strong need, an exception is made. In general, you cannot speak ill of another unless there is a Sharia countenance reason. Right? So when is backbiting permissible? Backbiting is permissible when it is done out of sincere concern for the good. Either sincere concern for the good of the person you're speaking about, or sincere concern for your good, when it has to do with your rights, or sincere concern for the wider good if there's a preponderating need or benefit that is fulfilled or harm that is averted by what you are going to mention. But one has to consider is this need with respect to that person or personal or public greater than the violation of the sanctity of their good name. Now the basis is that when feasible, one mentions things like this privately, not publicly. Right? Privately, not publicly. And so that's how we understand this, right? Number one. Number two, we cannot, people's names in general are their names, their reputation, it has sanctity. So you can't make judgments on anybody, on Sahaba, on scholars, just based on an individual statement. Right? Because when she says he is stingy, we understand the least that we need to understand. So you would understand that he is stingy, meaning he has some stinginess, right? He has some stinginess, right? You can't say, well, there are Sahaba who were stingy. That is not cautious, right? Just, right, that the starting assumption regarding people is having a good opinion, right? Having a good opinion. So if we need to affirm anything, we would assume the least. So, right? So, like here, he is stingy, meaning he has stinginess, and the least we assume, the ulama tells us, that he doesn't spend on his family as much as the wife felt that he should, right? Okay. So, then the Prophet ﷺ responded, take from his wealth that which you need for yourself and for your children. So then we look at what is the scope of this, right? What is the scope of this with respect to the wife taking her husband's property? First thing to understand is that كل المسلم على المسلم حرام. Everything of a Muslim is inviolable for another Muslim. دمه وماله وعرضه. Their life, their property, and their good name. So the property, right? The sanctity of someone's property that you cannot take of it applies within family as well. That parents cannot just take the child's property. Right? There are guidelines on how children's property may be used, and the basis is can only be used insofar as it's in the interest of the child and until they hit puberty. Right? Then when it comes to husband and wife, the same thing applies. There is sanctity with respect to the husband's property, there's sanctity with respect to the wife's property. Okay? And this is particularly sensitive if we look at traditional families with respect to the wife's property. The husband does not have the right of disposal over the wife's property. Right? And permission, one of the careful things about permission is that there could be outward permission, like someone doesn't object, but there's also inward permission. Right? Right? And that is the person, that's why the Prophet ﷺ said, لا يحل مال امرئ مسلم إلا بطيب نفس منه. That another's property is not permitted except with their goodwill, with their willingness. Right? So someone may not say no, right? But they do mind. They do mind. So that's subtle. That there is the outward muhasaba. Did she refuse? No. So in court, would she have a case against him? In qada? No. But in the court of courts, before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the wife says, I had $1 million that my grandfather gave me. I had wanted to spend it in charity and good, but my husband kept dipping into it. But he's the father of my children, etc. I wasn't able to say anything. So one needs to be very careful with respect to property and rights in that way. But then that also applies to husband's wealth as well. Likewise. That you cannot just say, well, we're married, my money is my money, his money is my money. All that stuff does not work. It does not work. And having too much shared wealth in that sense leads to problems. It's important to have clarity with respect to how wealth is broken down. Because very often, you find all kinds of marital disputes arising from this. And that's something we'll look at later. So when can a wife take from her husband's money? Right? Here, this is in the case where they have not agreed to her taking of the money. Because if كل ما ثبت بالتراضي فقد ثبت, anything that's established by mutual agreement has been established. So for example, if there was a common pool, there's, like in our times, a bank account. Husband says, okay, look, the monthly budget is this much, you can take it. And I'll give you an allowance, a discretionary allowance of this much. So they've agreed to that. Unless that changes, they've agreed to that. And the ulama recommend that that's what people should do with respect to property, right? That they agree on parameters with respect to their spending. Right? So even if, for example, the husband's the primary provider, they agree. They have the wife, these things she spends on, he gives her an allowance, and if that's agreed upon, that's agreed upon. But if the husband is being stingy in his infaq, in his providing, then the basis of providing, right? The basis is here that the husband has a duty to provide for his family. The nafaqa ala zawja wal iyal, it's a wajib shar'i, right? The duty to provide for one's wife, one's children is a religious duty. Even if the wife is wealthy, the husband has that obligatory duty. He has to provide for the wife and he has to provide for the children. And the criteria for provision is bil ma'ruf, in a good way, right? Which is what you see in this hadith as well, right? That take what you need bil ma'ruf, in a good way. So the husband's duty was to provide in a good way. What's meant by in a good way? What's meant by in a good way is with consideration of the husband's financial standing and the wife's socio-economic background. Right? So the husband's financial standing. So a wealthy husband has to provide. So there's two sisters. One married a multimillionaire. The other married a struggling artist. And they're twin sisters. Right? So the one who married the wealthy man has, he would have to provide for her between his financial standing and her socioeconomic background, between the two. And the woman, the twin sister who married the guy who barely makes anything, he has to provide a little more than he'd have to provide the daughter of struggling artists, right? You have to exert himself more because of her background. That's bil ma'ruf, in the way the fuqaha have explained it. So take from that bil ma'ruf. Here, bil ma'ruf relates to what you need, what is rightfully yours, right? In terms of this ma'ruf, what would be rightfully yours, but also in a good way here with respect to his wealth, right? Because you want to keep the basis of family life is al-mu'ashara bil ma'ruf. It's to live together in a good way, in a good manner. So bil ma'ruf, in a good manner, meaning be discreet about it. Be discreet about it. Or bil ma'ruf, take what you need, but convince him about it, etc. Right? In a good way. And this, of course, is not. There's also a lesson in this hadith that there's a distinction between the ruling of a qadi, a judge, and someone giving a religious verdict, a fatwa. Because in making qada, the qadi does not accept a claim unless he listens to both sides of the evidence. But that's not the mufti's duty. Someone's coming to seek a religious answer, you're answering their question. Right? Because the religious answer takes as a basis that what you're saying is true. Right? So let's say Zubair comes and says, my parents humiliate me and they intimidate me and they do this and they do that. If the person's asking for a religious ruling, would it be permissible for me to leave my house? So in a religious ruling, if you're seeking a religious ruling, the answer is yes, it would be. If you are being oppressed, it is permissible for you to leave your house. And there, so you take what the person is saying, that if what you're saying is sound, then this is the religious ruling. Right? Now, it is recommended for the person giving a verdict to consider likely circumstances, etc. It's recommended to give advice, giving likely scenarios, but that is not the mufti's duty. The mufti's duty there is نقل حكم شرعي صحيح, is to transmit a sound religious verdict. And there's a difference between giving a religious verdict and giving religious advice. And sometimes, in a sensitive issue, the person giving an answer may not give a religious verdict, they may give advice instead. Right? Or they may, for example, they may encourage, seek counseling, for example. They didn't give an answer because they didn't feel the answer would benefit. But strictly their responsibility is to give sound religious answers. Right? That's the difference between fatwa and irshad dini, and religious guidance. And a lot of times people err between getting a religious ruling, religious guidance, and mediation or formal legal judgment between two parties. That's a separate matter. So here, this is understood to be a fatwa from the Prophet ﷺ to Hind, not qada. He did not make qada because the husband wasn't present. He didn't make his case. So it's quite possible to get two contradictory rulings in the same situation. Imagine in the same situation, if in our times, Zubaydah complained to Mufti Yaqub Effendi that my husband is stingy, could I take what I need to pay the monthly bills? Say yes, you could apply this hadith as understood by the fuqaha to her scenario and says, yes, Sister Zubaydah, you can take this. If her husband were to come and not say that I'm married to Zubaydah, he says that if I provide reasonably for my wife, given all the debts that I have, does my wife have the right to take extra money from my account? What would the answer be? No, she doesn't, unless you agree. And ultimately, the two parties are responsible for acting soundly and responsibly. Right? The role of the religious scholar is not to run people's lives, but to give them the knowledge that they apply uprightly. So that's of course challenging, both for the mufti, the one giving religious verdicts, and the mustafti, the one seeking answers. So you have to be clear, what exactly are you seeking? Okay. The next hadith
عن ابن عباس رضي الله تعالى عنهما سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول من صور صورة فإن الله يعذبه حتى ينفخ فيها الروح وليس بنافخ فيها أبدا.
So Ibn Abbas, may Allah be well pleased with both father and son, relates that he heard the Blessed Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam say, whoever makes an image, Allah will punish them until they can give it a soul. This is something they could never do. This is something they could never do. So what does this apply to? A surah is a three-dimensional form. Right? The basis is a surah in classical Arabic is that which has a three-dimensional form. So it has to do with things like most directly to things, most explicitly, things like statues, but also images that have depth. Okay. Then the fuqaha then said, okay, what about flat images? What about flat images that don't have depth? And the overwhelming body of Islamic scholarship said the same thing applies to flat images, which are images that don't have. So surah is that which has a form, and the forms of things is three-dimensional. So it has to do with physical form or images with depth. Flat forms, they say it's same, right? Because the flat form is indicating the form of something. Now, here it's understood from this hadith, because it's talking about to give it a soul. What has soul? Living things. Animate beings, humans and animals. Right? Because we do not describe inanimate things, plants, vegetation, trees, stones, water, etc., as having a soul. Right? In a discernible sense. And the hadith is clear. If we look back at the hadith is clear that whoever makes an image, Allah will punish them until they give it a soul. Right? So this relates to images of humans or animals. Right? Whether it be tamathil, whether it be statues, or it be images, three-dimensional images with depth, or flat images, right? Or flat images. And so this is what is meant by image making in the hadith, right? That it's images of humans or living things, right? As for making images of inanimate objects, it doesn't fall under this hadith. Okay? So this is image making. And the assumption is that the person is making the image themselves. Right? In hadiths, we see an exception, which is dolls and images for children. Right? That the exception is mentioned, and much of Islamic scholarship is taking that to refer to children, even if the doll or the image has full human or animal form. And there's and the ulama also mentioned the exception of illustrations for educational purpose, right? Whether for doctor, for learning. Then the issue arises that what about photography? What about pictures? Right? What about pictures? And there is a body of scholars that have held, since the issue of photography came up, that photography is also image making. Others said no, photography is not image making, it is rather capturing reality, as it were. Right? It's capturing reality. You're not making an image, you are capturing an image. So they made a distinction, and that's what most scholars are on, right? But that caution has its merits, because if you see the fasad, the corruption that comes in through images, right? Imagine if the ummah were acting upon the more cautious opinion, and you don't have Instagram or TikTok or movies or this and that. Consider what is the effect of removing that kind of media from the lives of people and from the free time of people, right? And from their spiritual state and their social well-being as well. So while that's a sound position, right? First, the most explicit thing is one needs to be very careful about image making in general. And if someone makes paintings, etc., they should move to landscapes and things like that, because to keep away from what is impermissible. One cannot also acquire portraits and paintings of humans or animals because of this prohibition, according to the vast majority of Islamic scholarship. Also from the issue of suwar is statues as well, right? So decorative statues of humans or animals are also not permissible. So when it comes to digital images, if one does take the position of permissibility, but one has to have caution. One of the aspects is that there's the mudahatu khalqillah. It's like imitating Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation. Number two is the issue of the impact on your soul, right? The impact on your soul. In general, from the images of created things, even permissible. Because the heart only has one face, so to speak. So what you face affects your state, right? That's why all of spirituality is defined as sidqut tawajjuh ila Allah, soundly directing one's face to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so to speak. So there needs to be consideration, right? The ulama of the spiritual path caution about even the metaphorical imagery of creation being imprinted on your consciousness. Right? Ibn Ata'illah says in the Hikam, كيف يشرق قلب صور الأكوان منطبعة في مرآته. How can a heart be illumined when the forms of created things have been imprinted on the mirror of its heart, right? And he's not talking about the haram. It's just that if you busy yourself, right, with the forms of created things, then when will you direct yourself towards Allah? When will you direct yourself towards the next life? And behaviorally, the only way you can make good long-term decisions over short-term decisions, given the human inclination towards the immediate, which is behaviorally sound, Allah tells us, وَتُحِبُّونَ الْعَاجِلَ. You love the immediate. You also love the tangible. Whereas part of the test of this life is that the next life is coming. Right? It's in the future. And it appears intangible. The test of faith is to make our consciousness of Allah more tangible than our consciousness of the fleeting, metaphysically, right? And our consciousness of the hereafter more tangible than our consciousness of the immediate. وَلَلْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنَ الْأُولَى. The next life is better for you than this. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, وَتُحِبُّونَ الْعَاجِلَ. But you love the immediate. وَتَذَرُونَ الْآخِرَةَ. And you leave aside the next. So there, one needs to be aware that there are great wisdoms why Allah and His Messenger have discussed excessive attachment to tangible images. So if we take the position of the permissibility of images, right, then we should have caution and balance with respect to them, right? That you have to be very careful about haram imagery, number one, moving or still, right? But you also have to be careful about what enters your consciousness, whether it be sinful, disliked, or distracting. Right? The sinful is directly polluting. The disliked erodes. But heedlessness, right, disadvantages, but also opens the door for the disliked and the sinful. Right? So that's something that we need to have caution and restraint about. And one, at the same time, if you take the position of the impermissibility of digital images, you cannot condemn those who see the permissibility of it, because that is a lot of contemporary scholarship, right? And there's no condemnation and difference of opinion. But at the same time, if somebody takes the position of not wanting their picture taken, etc., then you cannot think ill of them, because they are taking a sound position within Islamic scholarship and a cautious position in Islamic scholarship. And we've touched a little bit about the wisdoms behind that. Any questions here before we look at the next hadith? Go ahead.
The surah can refer to a three-dimensional form or an image with depth, or also flat images. Then is there anything that looks like a human that's not a photo permissible?
In mainstreams, according to the majority of the scholars, no. Right? So if it is a human-made image, and it doesn't have to be made by hand, like if you use digital tools, but someone makes the image, then that. So is it a picture? Is it a drawing, an illustration of the person, or is it a picture of the person? Pictures are more straightforward, and then there's difference of opinion about certain areas, etc. That if it's a picture but you digitize it, etc., if it remains a picture, it's a picture, right? The next hadith.
عن ابن عباس رضي الله تعالى عنهما عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم: أحق ما أخذتم عليه أجرا كتاب الله عز وجل.
Right. So this is hadith number 97, right? Alhamdulillah. And in this hadith, which is related by Ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhu, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, the most deserving thing for which you are compensated is the book of Allah, mighty and majestic. The hadith outwardly would indicate that you have a right to take reward, compensation for any work that you do. Right? And if you would take compensation for any work that you do, then work that is worthy, like teaching Quran, is even more worthy of reward, of compensation for it. Right? So, and that is the position of a lot of Islamic scholarship, that you can charge for the teaching of Quran. But the Hanafis understood it differently, right? They said that the basis of all of the discharging of all religious duties is that they be done with the utmost of sincerity. وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ. They've been commanded only that they worship Allah, making their religious practice, their deen, solely for the sake of Allah alone. مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ. And ikhlas would entail that طلبا للثواب من الله سبحانه وتعالى دون غيره. That you're seeking the reward from Allah and nothing and none else. And this is confirmed by what we hear from all the prophets throughout the Quran. لا نسألكم عليه أجرا. We ask you for no reward for this. In أجري إلا على الله. My reward is only with Allah. Right? So the Hanafis, looking at this hadith with respect to reward for the Quran, ajr, right? That, and this would then by extension relate to, can you charge for religious teaching? They said no. The ajr mentioned in this hadith, if we take it on its outward, in terms of worldly reward, we would not accept it to refer to worldly reward, because ajr, right, is what you get for something that you've done, and the ibadah, its ajr is in the akhirah. So the thing most deserving of reward of anything that you do is teaching Quran. Why? Because its reward is from Allah, and it's rewarded tenfold to many times thereof. So it's referring to that reward. Number one. The second argument of the Hanafis with respect to this hadith is that this hadith is specific in its context. Even in Sahih al-Bukhari, it has come under charging for ruqya, right? For reciting Quran for the purpose of healing. So there are two things. You're healing somebody, and there's the recitation of the Quran, right? So it's the act of healing and so on that is being paid for, not the recitation of the Quran. So, and this is a well-established difference of opinion. However, the later Hanafis, now the basis is that, and the ideal, even according to the other madhab, the ideal is that those engaged in religious duties, teaching Quran, teaching the religious sciences, being imam of the masjid, being the mufti, being the qadi, providing religious guidance, etc. All of this is meant to be done lillahi ta'ala, free. Lillahi ta'ala. And that would include, if you look at what the scholars of Islamic spirituality have to say, devotional singing. Because devotional singing is a religious act. Right? So Quran recitation, devotional singing, this all meant to be lillahi ta'ala. But then there's a communal obligation to support all كل ما يتم به أمر الدين وأمر الدنيا. Right? All the things by which the religious good is preserved and fulfilled, and all the ways that the worldly good is preserved and fulfilled, all of that is part of the fard kifaya. When it comes to religious duties, because therefore the akhirah, there's a communal obligation that we be supporting scholars, teachers, da'is, imams, etc., in a manner that frees them from having to charge for it. Bil ma'roof, in a good way. In a manner that is dignified. Because that's the basis of of worldly living. Fid dunya hasana, the good of this life, right? Ma yatimmu bihi al-khair, that which fulfills good. That is the ideal. That is the ideal. And we've seen with the breakdown of religious institutions and the great harms of the corporatization of so much religious services across the world. We see that even in North America, for example, where we are, that if you see the people who established our communities in the 50s and 60s and 70s, the big growth of our communities, people were largely volunteers. Right? People were largely volunteers. People who established the masajid, people who established all these projects, they did so, and many of them are still serving 50 years later, 60 years later, right? They're elderly. Now people don't want to do two steps unless they're paid for it directly or indirectly. And that spirit of service goes, right? Talk to my booking agent, right? And that's something that ummatically, but at the same time, it is permitted to charge. Why? Because that communal obligation is not fulfilled. People do not support the ulama. People do not support students of knowledge. People don't support those serving in the community, etc. Right? So it becomes a mafsada. So one has to think about that in a deep way. So it is permissible to charge. If someone comes, let's say someone comes having memorized Quran, they come to a city, they need to survive. Now the basis would have been at the level of the community, that as a community, the community needs to be supporting the Quran teachers, the imams, the youth teachers, the counselors, all these people at a dignified level. If that doesn't happen, which it doesn't, then they have a right to charge, but they have a responsibility to have ikhlas, to do it for Allah. They have a responsibility to make the choices that are pleasing to Allah and not decide on the basis of the purely material. But that's between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And safety for them would be in consulting actively so that they can guard their intentions and to be careful to keep their motives and their plans carefully purposeful rather than just expedient. Right? So in later scholarship, generally they said, particularly in the absence of proper support for these things, it is permissible to charge. But you see, wherever Islam was well established, that there would be between government support, but also endowments, scholars and others would be carefully supported. Right? And there's, of course, a great need for support of religious scholarship so that people aren't put in a situation, and this is particularly true in our times when, living in a very materialized age, even getting by has become very costly. Even just merely getting by has become very costly. Right? That while standards of living have broadly increased, but at the same time, what is required for subsistence has gone up tremendously. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us as communities and as individuals that we have to look carefully as to how we spend our money. And one of the reasons why we don't spend our money on supporting religious scholarship and the projects supporting our communities religiously and socially is because we are extravagant and wasteful in our wealth, in our spending, right? So as they say, من اشتغل بما لا يعنيه فاته كثير مما يعنيه. If one busies oneself with that which is not of benefit, then much that is of benefit will be missed out by one. So we need to think about that insofar as our duty as members of communities, but also if we are in a situation of being a student of knowledge, seeking knowledge, or a teacher of knowledge, then one has to be very careful about our intentions. Why are we doing this? Right? A lot of times people say, well, they're a student of knowledge, say, well, if I memorize Quran, if I seek knowledge and also memorize Quran, I can get hired as an imam. Why do you want to get hired as an imam? Many people want to learn, they memorize Quran, they want to learn the maqamat. Right? Why? Because if I can have melodious Quran recitation, I can get hired for this. And they say, why else do you do it? So, of course I'm doing it for the sake of Allah. But that's where a person has to, you cannot think ill of anybody. We have to ask her, because the intention is what drives you to do something. What drives you to do something. And we have to be honest with ourselves, but also cautious, right? Honest with ourselves and cautious as to what drives us in our critical life decisions. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.